I'm delighted to be joined today by Jess Hill, who has an extensive career in journalism, including a period as a Middle East correspondent for the Global Mail and also as ABC background briefing reporter. Welcome, Jess.
Thanks, Mark.
Look, media law and censorship arise a lot in foreign correspondence, and in Australia we seem a world away from a lot of these issues that arise in those sorts of places. How does media law and censorship play out when you're working as a foreign correspondent?
Well, mostly for me, censorship, the way that I was restricted from reporting in terms of censorship was where I could or couldn't go. So one of the biggest frustrations for me was not being able to go to Saudi Arabia. It's very difficult to get a journalist visa there, and it's actually difficult to go there even as a tourist. So even if you want to pretend that you're not a journalist and go there as a tourist, you actually need an invitation from someone who's a business associate or a family member, which I didn't have. And so it's incredibly difficult to report from Saudi Arabia, and the same goes for Iran, and of course the same goes for Syria. So that was the most pressing and restrictive feeling of censorship when I was in the Middle East. And then, of course, I mean, really because I was writing for an international audience, not for a local audience, local censorship issues didn't play into my reporting as much. But, you know, obviously for local reporters in Egypt or in Lebanon or Syria, then, you know, the local censorship laws apply to them much more than a foreign correspondent.
I guess we're all local to an extent now, aren't we, with social media and web publications. We come under the law of any jurisdiction where our material's being read. So are you conscious of that as you do your work, that perhaps if you send a tweet or write a blog post that someone in that country might pursue legal action over it?
Well, I was in the Middle East at a particular time, so I was there in 2012, and at that point everything was a bit of a free-for-all, you know, so we'd come out of a period of dictatorship, at which time perhaps foreign correspondents would be a little bit more careful about what they say if they're living in Egypt or in any of the other countries that were under dictatorship. But whereas in 2012, it was all a little bit confusing. There was the people were in charge, but they sort of weren't paying attention. There was so much chaos that I didn't feel like I had to really worry about that. But say, for example, if I was in Lebanon and I wanted to go and report in Israel, or I wanted to report about an Israeli issue, that could be a problem because Lebanon and Israel are essentially still at war. And if anyone in Lebanon finds out that you've either been to Israel or that you're reporting on Israel, especially if it's favourably, that could be a big problem and you could be kicked out of the country. So it really depended on where I was reporting from, but by and large, the local censorship issues were not as fixed in place as they had been before the Arab Spring, or as they are now that the Arab Spring's really sort of deteriorated and gone back into a form of control.
That's really interesting. I guess there's no such thing as total press freedom anywhere or free expression anywhere. It's really just an ideal. We're lucky in Australia that we're kind of at the top end of the press freedom stakes. I think at the last Reporters Without Borders ranking we were high 20s, 28 or something like that. And many of these countries that you've been working in are much lower on that scale. Do you think Australian journalists really value the freedom that they have and appreciate that before they go away and do foreign correspondence elsewhere?
So do you think, like in the sense that do Australian journalists appreciate the freedom they have here and then go across and see the difference?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I can only speak for myself in the sense that, yeah, of course, when you go over to somewhere that's as chaotic and where there's as much propaganda as there is in somewhere like Egypt, you're very thankful for the fact that we at least have relative freedom in the independent press here. But I think it also highlights how the restrictions that we have on freedom here. And it's easy as an Australian journalist to think, oh, you know, those poor people in the Middle East, they have such restrictions on their freedom of expression. How lucky are we? And actually, when I went over there, I guess some of the things that came into more stark relief were things like, well, 70% of our media is controlled by one person who's taking a more and more aggressive line on protecting their patch of business, taking a more aggressive line against competitors such as the ABC or Fairfax, and also being partisan, supporting one party over another. These are the types of things that you see in the Middle East. You know, you see papers who are almost owned by a political party and they will just propagate one line. Now, I would hazard to say that at the moment, that the way that News Limited is operating is very similar to how some of the papers in the Middle East do. They're favouring one side of government, and there's basically anything that the other side of government does is trash, no matter what it is. And in a lot of ways, I think they've forgotten their readers, as do the newspapers in the Middle East, because they've got an agenda. And I think a lot of News Limited papers here have an agenda also. So I actually found that it brought into, it became more sharp in my focus, the types of restrictions that we have here, how difficult it is to get government ministers to go on the record, how difficult it is to get corporations to speak to you, all of those things. I thought, actually, we're not as lucky as we think.
And that's certainly the case. You've got all of these different dimensions to what we call media freedom, and sometimes we just look at what the government's restrictions might be, but we have media ownership and owners exercising their ownership rights over expression, and you also have government spin, as you've just mentioned. Occasionally we also have journalists being jailed, as we've just seen with Darren Hinch recently. You mentioned Egypt, and we've just had Peter Grest arrested and jailed. He's been in jail for a few months now, and there's no end in sight to that matter. How might something like that happen to a foreign correspondent, and what can they do to prevent it?
Well, I mean, essentially in the case of Peter, it's like wrong place, wrong time. And, you know, the charges against him are ludicrous. I think one of them is aiding and abetting a terrorist organisation, by which they mean the Muslim Brotherhood, which they have only just designated a terrorist organisation, and for which there is no evidence in terms of Peter's reporting, unless they consider talking to both sides evidence of aiding and abetting terrorism, which is quite an unbelievable interpretation of that charge. So in terms of like what could Peter have done? Nothing, except not go to Egypt. It just so happened that he was working for Al Jazeera. There are two versions of Al Jazeera. Well, there's three, but the two versions that play in the Middle East: Al Jazeera English and Al Jazeera Arabic. Al Jazeera Arabic has taken on a reasonably pro-Brotherhood line, but Al Jazeera English is quite a bit more independent, and I don't think has that type of pro-Brotherhood angle. Yet Peter, because he was broadcasting for Al Jazeera English, was just sort of like caught up in the hatred that the Egyptian government had for Al Jazeera Arabic. So I don't think there's anything that Peter or his colleagues could have done to prevent being arrested, besides perhaps operating in more secret, or just reading the tea leaves a bit and just deciding not to go to Egypt at all because the hatred against Al Jazeera was so strong. So really in places like the Middle East, China, lots of other places where there's strict restrictions on press freedom, journalists can fall victim to, you know, political whims without a lot of warning, and not of their own fault a lot of the time.
Part of their preparation before going, though, and probably wouldn't have prevented things in that case, but surely part of the preparation might be researching what the main laws are that affect the media in a destination before they go there.
Well, and certainly that, I mean, you can do things that aren't stupid. You can stop yourself from putting yourself in danger, but when you look at like the types of the legal situation in Egypt, it's really there's no amount of preparation, as you say, that could have stopped Peter being arrested, and in many cases, I mean, there was a case of an Australian journalist who was arrested in Egypt. He was in near a factory that's known for its worker strikes, and the unions had threatened a big strike that was that the government saw as quite a significant threat. He was arrested. He was arrested without a visa, either a visa to be in Egypt or a media visa. That was very problematic, and if that's the case, then that's trouble of your own making to a certain degree. So you can certainly prevent those things from happening, but they arrested him on a political cause anyway. So even if he'd had the visas, maybe they'd have held him under arrest regardless.
And that's a basic media law issue. I think another journalist has just been sent home from Indonesia for also trying to report while on a tourist visa, a television crew. So that's a basic thing all journalists can do to keep inside the law. Jess, it's been great talking about media law and censorship with you, and we're looking forward to more foreign correspondence from you in the near future.
Thanks, Mark.